All right, well, I would just like to start with a couple of brief introductions and then I'll get out of the way. Again, my name is Kathryn Kaiser. I work at the University of Alabama at Birmingham in the Nutrition Obesity Research Center in the Office of Energetics. It's my great pleasure to share really the room, but especially the panel with these two gentlemen. I'm just going to read a brief bio. And so on the far side is Dr. Daniele Fanelli. He is trained as a naturalist, an evolutionary biologist, and a science writer. And before specializing in the study of scientific misconduct, bias, and related issues, which is where he's now doing that at the Metrics Center at Stanford University with several Illuminati. And then immediately to my right is Dr. Jeffrey Flier. He is an endocrinologist and authority on the molecular causes of obesity and diabetes, and is presently the Caroline Shields Walker Professor of Medicine in the Department of Medicine and Neurobiology at Harvard Medical School. He recently stepped down from a position as Dean of Harvard Medical School after a 9-year term. And he also has served as the Chief Academic Officer for Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center, which is a Harvard teaching affiliate. So, gentlemen, the discussion we had earlier was a little bit about some of the themes over the past 2 days, and you all sit kind of, I think, in your present work maybe in slightly different perspectives. One of the things that I think would be helpful is to especially maybe help guide some of the younger early career people in terms of maybe activities that they can engage in that you think would be particularly helpful in the area of reproducibility and rigor. Would you like to start?
Sure.
Okay.
So first, I've greatly enjoyed the meeting. It's only in the last 6 or 8 months that I've been starting to think a lot about this whole area, and the meeting has really helped crystallize my thinking, and in some cases confused my thinking in a number of these areas. So just to say a couple of words about my own background and what my perspective on this is. So I've 30 years as a physician scientist, where my dominant role was doing experimental work in metabolic disease in animal models and a bit in humans. 9 years, as you said, as the Dean of Harvard Medical School. Now, that's an organization that has 10,000 full-time faculty, very complicated ecosystem of 16 affiliated institutions. And among other things, in that role, I played a role overseeing and in many cases having to deal with issues regarding appointments and promotions and recruitment and retention. Also played the role as the institutional official for that large faculty regarding issues of integrity and misconduct. So I may, in that way, get to be a little biased by the things that I see, many of which don't even ever get discussed. Also, the educational program for MDs and PhDs, of which there are quite a lot, and how we try to educate them both for their specific careers and for those who do research to handle that better. And then just to say that, in the role as Dean, as you might imagine, a lot of my activities, in addition to managing the organization, was to be an advocate and spokesperson for the school and the faculty. And in that regard, a lot of what I did was to try to convince the world around us how great what we did was, and I do believe that was something I was very committed to. On the other hand, as my term went on and as I had to deal with various issues, I did become increasingly concerned about some of the issues that this meeting is addressing. And my ability both to have the time and the kind of the role of taking that on, was hard as Dean. And now, beyond my tenure in that role, I feel that this is something to which I would like to be able to contribute. So in my thinking about this whole area, I think it's very hard to not see all the interacting pieces. It's like a systems biology problem. We have the research community itself, the researchers and their local departments that have cultural elements that are very important. We have the funders that have expectations. We have the journals without which our research doesn't really become real. We have the press interested in talking about our research. We have donors. And then we also have the academic organization that appoints and promotes people according to some standards that should be, proper ones and get very confusing. As I think about these issues, I'm constantly trying to imagine how they all interrelate rather than to view them as each independent entities. So maybe just to cut to the chase with a few of the things that I've taken away from the meeting about things that should be done by my successors and to some degree with me as a person rooting from the sides. So in the area of training, I do believe that a great deal of the problem that we're talking about in this meeting relates to improper training of our scientific community. And I know that in my school, there is no single place where you train people to do science. I mean, it occurs distributed all over the place and with different cultures in different parts of the organization. And I am quite convinced that statistics is a major deficit. There's no way that is not true. We were trying to get more statistical training for various scientists at Harvard Medical School, but I can tell you that it's not easy. And I also think, this is the yang for the yin, and that is that it takes more than a course. This is something that has to be repetitively brought to the attention of people. It has to be, and it's not just the students, by the way. I know that there are many faculty whose work is highly dependent on very sophisticated statistical analysis who have told me that they themselves don't feel comfortable. So we have a deep systemic problem there, and I think we need to put a lot of attention on it, put some resources into it, and go from there. The other thing on the integrity issue, teaching people what is the right thing to do in research and not. You can have courses, and we have courses. We need better courses. But my understanding after the career that I've had is that the trainees are infinitely more influenced by the behavior of their mentors than they are by any course that they take. And when they see mentors behaving in a way that is not proper, they are more likely than not to adopt that in their future career. A couple of words about publishing, and that I think that I have great concerns about the way the publishing industry works vis-a-vis the conduct of science. I'm not happy with the fact that so many of the high-profile journals are driving the agenda of what kinds of papers you need to publish and what you need to do. And I do believe at the margins that set of expectations is taking susceptible people and having them cut corners and do things that they shouldn't do. Ultimately, the responsibility is the scientist, but I believe the context, some of which has been discussed by others here, is very material. I've also been thinking about peer review quite a bit, and I think I previously overestimated the importance of peer review. I mean, I know that as a scientist, and I know other scientists have said that they are not infrequently, they can improve a paper as a result of peer review, and I fully accept that and experience that. At the same time, I think a lot of peer review is shallow, some of it is vindictive, and because it is hidden behind anonymity, both the name of the reviewer, of course, which I now feel should be revealed, but I know that that's an extreme minority opinion, and I know what some of the counters to that are. I believe it's incumbent on us to actually publish the reviews as part of the record, which some journals are doing. Then we might begin to have the ability to do proper research on how peer review relates to the quality of the final product. I'll just say a word about promotion. That's important. Many people have pointed out that the incentives for promotions in academic organizations are misplaced. I can say that in my own organization that I ran, I saw that. It was very hard to counter it because it's so omnipresent. The emphasis on how many papers do I need to be an assistant, an associate, and a full professor. And even if you tell people it doesn't boil down to the number of papers, the folklore convinces people that that's true. Do they need to be in certain kinds of journals? What's the citation index and all of that? And I think that there's less deep assessment of the quality of the scholarship. It's very spotty, though. There are departments that I have, and I know very well, where that is done infinitely beautifully. No one will be given tenure unless there is a deep analysis of the quality and the impact of the work. But through other elements of our school and other schools, I believe that that is given, insufficient attention. And maybe I'll just say one or two other words, and then I'll stop. And that is, I've been trying to think about what would be some procedural approaches that we might adopt from things that I've learned that would help deal with these issues. And one that I've come up with, and I only mentioned it to one or two people at lunch today, so I'll throw it out there, is related to what we ask our faculty to do when they're being promoted at different levels. We spend a lot of time, we just put out a new faculty handbook, details what you need to say in your CV, what kinds of information needs to be in there. If you don't do it exactly the way we like, we'll give it back to you. One thing I think I'd like to consider asking people to do now, perhaps it's silly, but I'll ask for some response, and that is to require the person being promoted to actually have a section that deals with the known or suspected controversies over their own work. So much of what we see in these packages are basically sales jobs. They're designed to cover up or avoid or deflect the issues of uncertainty. Sometimes they're there, but we don't get to know about them except randomly when someone writing a letter decides to bring it up, which they may or may not do as a matter of statistical chance. So what would be the advantage of that? Well, I see a few. One is it sends a message right away from the institution that we care deeply about that. We want to know what's controversial about your work, and we want you to be the one to tell us, because who else would know that more than the person whose work it is? Maybe over time it will change the behavior, and it will enable us to have some objective assessment of what the scientists actually revealed about their own self-awareness of their own work. Many complexities to this. It could be done wrong. It could be negative in its impact. But I'm beginning to think about it, and I'll stop there.
Thank you.
Okay, well, I would also like to start expressing my appreciation for the organization of this conference. I thought that not just the quality, but the diversity and the level of maturity and scientific rigor of the talks that I heard in these 2 days is outstanding in ways that I'll also try to articulate even a little more in a second. Because in terms of contributing to solutions, I have done, or trying, I'm still trying to do my little part, and interestingly also it's mainly in the area of research integrity and incentivizing and rewarding certain kinds of behaviors, and so perhaps that's something we can discuss a little more. But there was something that I really was hoping to bring at this point here, particularly inspired by, again, the kind of tone that I heard in the talks during these 2 days, which has to do with the premises of what we're doing here and what we're discussing. Because much of my research interests have been around getting numbers, essentially numbers around the entity and prevalence of the kind of problems we are talking about, and verifying the many assumptions or hypotheses we make about them. And I'm going to characterize these beliefs globally as a little unfairly and obviously very simplistically as the sort of the crisis narrative. So the idea that science is in crisis, a reproducibility crisis, and you can break down that further in presumably saying that science is awash with false or unreproducible findings, and that somehow things are getting worse. And attached to that, usually, and we heard that mentioned a few times in these 2 days, there is this perception that whilst the causes of this trend are multiple, of course, there is at least one major endogenous factor, which has to do with sort of the incentives, and particularly the compulsion to publish that we are forced to have as researchers. It was shown yesterday that, for example, Nature ran this very large survey amongst its readers, asking, how many people believed this idea, and the numbers were quite staggering. And just out of curiosity, I thought I would run the mini survey here with highly predictable results, I guess. But how many of you sort of believes that science is in crisis? Raise your hands. Okay, well, that's actually quite balanced, you see. So it goes in what, I guess I gave out what I'm about to say, which I think that those who raise the hand now are at least partially wrong. Again, I've been trying for years myself to get numbers about the prevalence of misconduct, but again, I don't think we're very interested in discussing that here. But more importantly, much more importantly, biases and publication biases. And lately, we had ever more refined data, not produced by me, that sort of has been testing the same kind of idea. And as I think you got a sense, for example, one outstanding example of that is the Reproducibility Initiative in Psychology, which is an unprecedented form of study, and it marks, in my view, the beginnings of a new science, which we like to call meta-science, and I think that's quite an accurate representation. But that study, for example, was amply reported by the media and still portrayed, I gotta say, implicitly or explicitly by many of the speakers in these 2 days, at least, as somehow a unpleasant finding, so that 40% figure. Notwithstanding all the uncertainties that then some of the speakers actually pointed out around what actually this figure means, or whether we're actually able to measure reproducibility, my priors as to how reproducible psychological science were so low that once I saw 40%, I was very pleasantly surprised. And again, and that was just based on the basic figure and the good work that paper in Science did in outlining the different ways in which you can look at it. And the 40% figure is actually the most pessimistic. 40% is not low. The figure is probably higher. It could never be 100%. And so with that in mind, to me, that already is not a result that one could really use to claim that in psychological science there is the kind of serious crisis some people think there is. There are other studies that, using different techniques, have looked at the same kind of idea, somehow trying to estimate the rate of false positive results across the literature. And again, even though they're highly contested, and they should be, all the figures they come up with are usually relatively low. So there is no study, essentially, to my mind, that has shown literally that the vast majority of studies in any given field is very high. Rather, actually, I think that's part of the issue. So at the moment, we are still in the paradigm of essentially randomizing a test across science or across a broad area of science and checking what the average is, which is somewhat inevitable, but the average is not as low as we might have expected, or some of us might have expected, which to me goes to say that there are likely pockets of research where these problems are very serious and need addressing, and those probably not coincidentally are the areas where a lot of these concerns and these theories and these methods come, and are mostly the areas, for example, that we hear discussing in conferences like these as well. But that's not true everywhere else. And this actually would bring me to the argument of solutions. But before I go there, there's the other element about the crisis, which has to do with whether matters have got worse and whether pressures to publish are to blame. Have matters got worse? There is consistent evidence, but rather reproduced evidence, independently reproduced evidence, that actually replicated evidence, that does suggest that things are changing in the literature, in ways that to some extent might suggest a worsening of a certain kind of, you may call it bias, but for all we know at the moment, has a lot to do with the way we present things, possibly spin, possibly simply decisions about what goes into the abstract rather than in the papers, for example. We don't quite literally know if it is true literally that these biases have been worsening, and in any case, again, they clearly haven't gone down to zero everywhere in science. And some evidence that we have would indicate that at best this would be sort of a sensible, a perceptible trend, but a very minor one. As for the pressures to publish idea, there is definitely a perception there, because there are countless surveys and I would say personal perceptions that I think we all have, and anecdotal evidence that will tell that we feel that there is a problem with this. But if you look at the data, again, there is nothing really to support at least some of the ideas that come with it. So for example, a couple of years ago, we did this study looking at the paper productivity, let's say, it's an ugly word, but of over 41,000 scientists who had published throughout the 21st century in all disciplines. These are the papers that we could find in the Web of Science. So it's it's a imperfect sample, although if anything it would be biased backwards in time. And what that showed is that it is true that the total number of papers that these researchers published during the first 15 years of their careers has grown over the years. We have many more papers in our CVs today than we used to 50 years ago. But, as we all know, and someone mentioned this today as well, co-authorship has grown enormously, in fact exponentially. And if one adjusts for co-authorship in a variety of ways, there is no increase to be spoken about. Now, one might argue, okay, maybe we're not technically publishing more papers, but we are fragmenting these papers. We are selling them more, and salami slicing is the buzzword here, with the idea that we are fragmenting our results to get ever more papers out there. But as a matter of fact, there is, to my knowledge, no overall evidence that this is the case. And in fact, for example, in our data, we could clearly see that papers were getting longer over time. And there are some studies, one of which published actually in PNAS a few years ago, who looked at specific areas, particularly of biomedical research, which clearly show that papers are actually getting more data-dense, more complex, and there's similar evidence actually in psychology as well. So there are ever more studies, experiments condensed within one paper. So the trends, if anything, are going in quite a different direction from what we commonly say. And so what this and the other kinds of evidence, I think, points to is the fact that somehow the narrative that there is a crisis here that we need to confront, and so that we need to discuss in a sense about solutions even, is questionable, in my opinion. And what I particularly liked about many of the talks was that even though I think, by and large, still they presupposed a lot of this narrative, most of the speakers were very careful about how they phrased their ideas, and were very open to reconsidering their positions and to see them critically examined somehow. And so this shows to me that the whole idea of meta-science is maturing. But what I really want to say with regards to discussing solutions is that I don't think so none of what has been suggested, for example, today, and in fact yesterday as well, in terms of what we can do, is surely not objectionable, and it does not need a crisis narrative to be sustained or supported. And there are complexities that, particularly if you abandon this grand narrative and become more subtle about what exactly you want to address and where, then you have to confront. So there will be problems that apply to some fields of research and not others, and there will be therefore solutions that apply to some fields and not others. And more importantly, and this is something we haven't talked, I think, too much yet, and quite justifiably so, but there are costs involved in any solution, in any intervention that we want to enact. And those costs are not going to be similar across the border. Again, it very much depends on the specific research field you're tackling. Well, I'll finish with one thing, actually, with regards to advice for young researchers and solutions. So the precious to publish story, I think it's false, but there are other findings that, at least in our research, but with multiple independent proxies, are rather consistent. Namely that it seems rather consistent that early career researchers tend to be associated with whatever proxy of faulty research, potentially. And interestingly, this matches mathematical predictions about where the sort of cost benefits of cutting corners and taking risks would lie. And connected to that, there's the aspect of collaboration. So there is mounting, not as strong evidence, but mounting evidence that long-distance collaborations, for example, are a risk factor for producing biased or flawed, even fraudulent research. And so with that in mind, there is certainly a call to be made for what has been said from the beginning within particularly the area of research integrity, which is the importance of mentorship, the importance of training scientists and sort of socializing young researchers into both the methods and the norms of science. And there are, I think, hidden challenges in some of the trends we celebrate, such as collaboration, which was proposed as one of the straightforward solutions to these problems, which actually need to be examined a lot more. And I'll stop here. And
Dr. Flier, would you like to comment on some of those remarks?
Let me try one. So just on the issue of whether there's a crisis or not. So interesting, I'm having read some of your stuff. I cited some of your stuff as the basis for saying there was a crisis. But so let me try to slice that a little bit, and that is that there's two parallel questions at least. One is, what's the actual factual base of knowledge as to how much research that is published is false? Separate from whether it's reproducible, but is false. And certainly the narrative around that has been going up tremendously. And I think the concern about it is much more significant now by scientists and leaders than it was 10 or 20 years ago. So there's the issue of, is it getting worse? And if so, why? And which are the influences and the incentives? And, you commented on that. The second part is it a crisis because everyone thinks it's a crisis? So I think if you're looking at it from the point of view of leadership of science, of organizations that are dependent upon funding and support from the government, from donors, from foundations, if there is a broadly increasing view that there's a problem with the correctness of scientific observations, then we have a crisis to deal with. And maybe your antidote to the crisis is to convince people that it's not a crisis. But I don't know that that's going to work very well. So I think we want to know what the facts are, but we also have to have a strategy to deal with the impact of this view that is increasing and is being supported by books and conferences and many other things. I see it really. I mean, in my time as dean, one of my jobs was to raise money. Well, the first few years I was dean, I didn't have major donors asking me about this. In the last couple of years, I had major donors not giving gifts because they say, well, what you do isn't true. So, I mean, this is going to snowball, and the practical implications are separate but related to what the factual base is. And from sitting at this meeting, I understand more than I did before all the complexities of how do you determine whether something is a replication. I mean, I started out myself with a more naive notion of that, and now I have much more sophistication about that. But I don't think that it's going to be enough to just say, oh, it's hard to replicate something even if everything's fine. We have to have a deeper narrative that answers the question that I raised about why it is a crisis.
So, right. So we do have a deeper narrative that can be completely alternative to that, and I'll mention that in a second. In fact, it came out already, I think, in this conference. But let me first of all emphasize that you're absolutely right, and the fact that stuff that I published in the past, in my own understanding at the time, seemed to support the crisis narrative, if you like, and it should be witnessed to the fact that I don't have. I just try to be guided by the evidence and by how I see it. And, I happen to spend a lot of time sort of looking at my own evidence and other evidence. And in the studies that I conducted, I was genuinely looking for evidence of what I thought was going to show up as that phenomenon, and it doesn't. And again, you rightfully call for evidence. But again, for me, and I'm surprised that that is not so for other people as well. For example, data from the Reproducibility Initiative in psychology, and there were then other studies. There was a similar one in economics. There was another one, the Many Labs project in psychology, and others. Was genuinely a turning point in showing that, again, you should start from the view that no one ever thought or should think that every single result is tried by someone else and produces exactly the same finding. Although less so in a field like psychology, which already, according to my own data at the time, was, seemed to be in the worst position of all disciplines. And that made sense for a lot of theoretical reasonings that I think are still valid. And so, I look forward to seeing what cancer biology shows. And, my prediction by now is that cancer biology is going to depend on how you define reproducibility, but it's going to look even less worrying in that sense. So it's going to be above 40%, and we'll see what happens. But exactly, one should be guided by evidence and should be mindful of the fact that even though sociologically it might be true to some extent that a crisis narrative helps gain support in some situations, it also has a very heavy cost in terms of public understanding, public respect, and the interest of young researchers in science itself, scientific skepticism, and so on. And so we should be very mindful to endorse the narrative that is best supported by the evidence. Now, there is a completely different view that is amply supported by the evidence, and that explains pretty much everything that we discuss. And it's a grand narrative, I think, that we can all enthusiastically buy into, which is that science is transforming itself as the rest of society is, largely because, to put it bluntly, computers are taking over. They're taking over our lives in many different ways, and they are greatly expanding our capacity to do science and to mine the complexities of phenomena. And that creates whole new challenges, which is what we are confronting. Computers are obviously in transforming the way we communicate and the expectations we have about interacting with each other. And so in a sense, this idea of a reproducibility crisis is created by the concept of reproducibility that we now endorsed, which I don't know if Victoria would agree with this view, but in my understanding, essentially was produced in computational sciences, where reproducibility is fully and entirely attainable, and has now been exported to the rest of science, partially because computers are ever more important in all the sciences, and so there is definitely at least that component of reproducibility to be taken care of across all methodologies. But it got enmeshed with what used to be well understood as forms of replication, conceptual replication, pseudo-replication, direct replication, and so on. And in ways that somehow confuse people as to what we are really talking about. So many times we speak about reproducibility as an all-encompassing term that presupposes that underlying evidence is true or not, or it's valid or not, or it's important or not. And things are way more articulated, should be more articulated in more refined and complex ways. And so simply the idea that we are facing this new era of communications and computational potential, and you can buy in all the geeks in the world by telling them that essentially a lot of these tools that we are creating will eventually be taken over by artificial intelligence, which will do science in place of us. And there's something I think grandiose about it, which would fully inspire people to pursue many of these initiatives and these efforts and interventions in ways that don't need to presuppose any sort of scientific drama. Again, we should be open. There are problems, surely. There is fraud, there is bias, but again, it's evidence by now tells us that it's not across the border. It's not as pervasive as we might fear, and I think that message should go out to the public, if anything.
Well, Dr. Fanelli, for a hypothetical scenario, what if maybe some of the leadership at Harvard were to go to Dr. Flier and say, we believe that this is particularly a problem in your department, and we would like to know what you're going to do about it, and leave it at that. What would you, maybe as an advisor to him, do or say to help him either gather data about what's going on at his institution or in his department and try to put that in that kind of perspective using data? How could he go about tangibly rebutting or refuting this idea that it was a particular problem or that certain steps might need to be taken?
So I would wonder, why would people come up with that allegation? Presumably, hopefully, they would have
fear
they would
and
have
pressure
evidence
from
of their
funding
own.
people. The funders are drying up, and we need you to fix it. That happens at institutions.
Well, it's also a reputational issue because there's also the comparative reputation. So every institution would like to say, well, we know this goes on, but in my institution, in this department, it doesn't. So everyone is always trying to position themselves. So is there a factual basis for trying to position an institution or a department in a better way than others, or is that just a fool's errand?
Well, you see, so this is, for example, where being careful about how we examine data and the evidence that we use to inform our arguments comes in very handy. Let me make you an example. It's going to go a little bit away from what you're saying, but I think we'll go back to it. So countless times people quote as evidence for a growing crisis in science the fact that retractions have been growing up. And it has been mentioned yesterday, in fact, that it's actually quite easy, and I did this in a paper in PLOS Medicine, to show that that's not actually the case. For one thing, if you know the history of this, you will know that the very idea of retracting papers is extremely new, and there are excellent surveys done amongst journals, in fact, high-ranking journals in biomedical research, to show that just about in 2004, I think it was 22%, I'm going to misquote surely the percentage, but a very low percentage of journals had a policy at all to deal with allegations and to retract papers. 10 years later, they repeated that survey, and the numbers are way higher, but it's still 66%. So 66% of the high-ranking journals in clinical medicine or biomedical research have policies, essentially know what to do if they are confronted with a case of scientific misconduct. That alone would tell you that if retractions are growing, that's because finally we are retracting papers that needed to be retracted straight away. And of course, the numbers are very small. So if anything, reaching a physiological small percentage of fraud that we all know surely always happened in science. And by the way, if you look at which was what that PLOS Medicine paper did, the rate of retractions per retracting journal, you realize that actually on average any journal only retracts 1 or 2 papers per year. So all this expansion that you see in the number of retractions is because more journals are retracting, literally. And this is not taking into account a number of confounding factors having to do with how we are getting better and better at doing investigations, for example. And so, whereas before an author had one retraction, now they get investigated and they might get dozens of retractions if they were serial fraudsters and so on. So all these confounding factors, and we are scrutinizing the literature more, of course. So everything that you adjust for will tell you that retractions are not growing, but for perfectly good reasons. And so this should be celebrated. And yet people, scientists even, not so much for institutions, although I wouldn't be surprised if someone went in that direction, but for journals, for example, pointed out how, high-ranking journals have more retractions, hence this proves that these journals are awash with false results because people want to publish there and they'll cut corners, etc., etc. Completely wrong, of course. Those journals were the most proactive in giving themselves policies. They are obviously also the best scrutinized and so on. And so again, there was always a way to reframe all this evidence in a completely positive spin, if you like, in saying, well, we are really tackling the problems finally, and what you are perceiving as evidence of wrongdoing, it's actually evidence that we are the ones who are best tackling the problem. And if you make a comparison with a state with no police, where therefore no crime ever happens, and a state where you start building a police force and finally you have crime reported, I think everybody would understand that. And that's largely what I would see, any situation like this hypothetical scenario.